Okay, here we're looking into a video that I got the information for right at the end of last year at Christmas, and I made mention of it in my year-end video and a recap one that I had done, just in passing pretty much, as one of the upcoming things that I was going through in a chain of little events that I was pointing out. And so I want to look into this more. This is an article that says skin color didn't matter to the ancient Greeks and Romans. And so they show a picture of a ladder slave market here. And as you can tell, it's not really bustling apparently. But from left to right, there is a small young boy and then a man who is drawn tanner and stuff and pretty buff. Looks like he could really do something for you. He could be a servant or somebody you really needed to do something with. Um, Paler woman here, all covered up. Looks to be a little older, maybe 30s ish or more, 30s ish. And then a younger lady here, barely clad, red haired, and very pale. Another lady back here, very pale, and even a young girl, each of them having a marker on their neck. And then a black person that's shown in here. She has like stockings painted on her feet. Why does that keep switching? Pardon me. Has stocking like painted on her feet, and then a sash that would go around her body is really just wrapped around her butt and then pulled back through like this. And there's a lot of styles that go that way. In fact, his is done the same way, really, with the side hatch. But so I want to look into this. There's a lot I could say about this and go off for hours, I guess, before we even get to the first inkling of it. But you can see here this Roman man and how he's selling things, and I'm sure he and the women and so on would be a whole lot more tanner than what is really kind of depicted here if they were sitting out in the sun, of course. But even in this, you can kind of see the women are kept pale and the men are drawn more tan, and then nobility are drawn paler too. You can see he's drawn his tan to even give the expression on his face. They had to do it and give himself somewhat of a tan, but then his arms, which are exposed, are definitely not the color of his head. So does he let his robes down his arms all the way and cover up himself quite often or anything? No, not so much. Not the same way. Cool looking sneakers he's got there really almost look like modern shoes with the toes cut out, but this is an old painting, so, and before modern shoes, really. It's kind of neat too. And almost looks like they have a velcro hasp on them. You see this right here across the top? I mean, I've seen this where people have taken weird ones and they're like, look, spacemen came down and gave people shoes and all kinds of weird things. But it's an oddity. It's an OOP picture here and stuff, because it also involves black people where they really weren't at that time, or in a real sparing amount. But whenever they show a slave market, quite often this is shown in. And of course, you have to include black people nowadays in just about everything. I'm going to read this article, which is written in a modern PC vernacular and is quite misleading. And I'm going to try to correct it as it goes, which is going to be kind of strange. We could go through a whole paragraph and then try to go back and correct it, but let's just go as we do, if you will. If you want, you can pause it and read it all, and then we can go, and then you can hear what I'm saying. So, the term racism refers to a phenomenon of group hatred or bigotry based on ethnic and cultural prejudice. Ethnic or cultural prejudice, not genetics or race, really, what it's saying here. In the United States, the term is most often heard in conjunction with the descriptors black or African American. Blacks have become quite racist here lately, and they say a lot of things. It's odd. You'll hear this, they were the Hebrews of the Bible, whenever they're not even really. Black people aren't a part of the Bible. It was all these Caucasians, or they were Egyptians, or all these type of things, whenever the Egyptians weren't black, and they wouldn't be even related to the Nubians that were close to there, or the people, of the Khoisan, or any of those really related to it. It's easily genetically can tell where people come from, and in that attempt, they end up making their own racist lies and then getting mad about them. And it's kind of disgusting, really, whenever reality is really looked at in correct form as to how that all went down. But yeah, also they always say, blacks are held down by the man. If racism was really what people try to blow it up to be in America, black people wouldn't be in America. I mean, come on. We are propping them up. We're giving them all kinds of advantages. I don't want to go into it, but just so many advantages all the way through school and in every which way to make them feel like they're not disadvantaged in some way. I mean, it's kind of gotten disgusting in a modern day where things are getting extremely twisted. And then, of course, there's the white man bad BS that's going on in our own country. It's amazing. Anyhow, and of course, the starting points for such conversations usually converge around the American Civil War of the 1860s. And of course, it always has to begin there. If we look back before then they were really a almost pre-Stone Age level people that were illiterate, didn't have any writing. And yeah, you can point out in his BD and things, nobody even knows what that crap means. There's no writing that was there. They didn't have advanced cultures that matched to anything that's going on in other places. Just like the Amerindians and stuff. We're not gonna lie and try to say, oh yeah, well they were rocket science. No. But people try so hard nowadays. They're gonna try to interject them into Rome here and this, and I believe she goes as far as to trying to put them all the way up through Eurasia and the Indo-Europeans, believe it or not. As such, racism and slavery are two ideas put hand in hand, often, though not exclusively. In other words, whenever whites used to enslave whites before they ever figured out black people existed, and they were still doing whites on whites at that time. And in fact, the Irish were the first slaves of America, and there were 6 times more than there were blacks in America, at least to the first sector of it. But we're not going to go there, are we? Anyhow, but racism was not what it was before. It was almost cultural, because these were Caucasians on Caucasians on Caucasians all over Proto-Indo-European lands, from India up to China, up in Russia, all the way across through Europe, all the way down into Egypt, North Africa, around the entire Mediterranean, no stoppage, over into Yemen, across Sumerian lands where the Bible comes from, to India again, and everything in the middle. There's not like secret black people someplace, which I think this is what we're fixing to try to hear. Anyhow, culminating around the black minority. So, as such, racism and slavery are two ideas put hand in hand, often, though not exclusively, culminating around the black minority. Blacks are 13% of the population, floating around there. And, whites have gone from their 87% that they were way back in the day, or really, 50, 60 years ago, to all of a sudden down in the 60s, and everybody's trying to freak out about it. I think we allowed a lot of minorities in third world countries in, and the idea, I think, originally was to get them in here, and then they would go back and help their own country. It was like, how it is there and stuff, but it seems to have, to where they just want to come in our country and try to tell us what to do. And it's getting out of hand quite a bit, but that's politics and crap. Let's get off of that. When considering further back in history, some wonder if there was a discrimination against black individuals in the Western ancient world, for instance, during the Golden Age of Pericles or at the height of the Roman Empire. Well, no, there wasn't. They really didn't know black people existed. Sub-Saharan Africans really didn't come into play. If you look at ancient Herodotus's maps, which we might take a look at here in a moment, it'll show you they really didn't know it existed. And the only Negroids that were really running into that time were these Nubians. This is before the Bantu expansion, and there weren't black people all over the place. In fact, their old term Ethiopian actually just meant sunburnt faces. And these are people that, from their own accounts, living close to the equator or farming a lot, ended up making him quite tanned. And so it had to do with those type of people. In a minute we'll look at their extent and where they were all over the place, and the fact that it's not even black people. They also talk about the southern Indians and how dark they are, and those are like the darkest and stuff, and they're like, wow, you know, and they're close to the equator. And they say the same type of thing about way above the Nile. And anyhow, let's go on. It can be argued that racism has always existed in a sense, both on individual and group levels, but racism specifically against darker skinned individuals appears to be a relatively new concept. Yay, a correct term there. Yeah, that's because they didn't know the rest of the world existed, and the world didn't know them. Just as much as Amerindians didn't know the rest of the world existed pretty much, and we didn't know they existed. Black people in sub-Saharan Africa didn't know Egypt and all the rest of the world, or the biblical people, or Chinese, or any of those people existed. They had no clue. Seriously, let's be honest. Though slavery was a prominent part of daily life of the ancient world, as it was during the American Civil War, and for thousands and thousands of years before that, and in Africa and the Islamic slave trade, which started 900 years before anybody even found America, that people don't even want to talk about, the enslaved were conquered, not necessarily individuals whose skin was a different shade from their conquerors. White on whites, Barbary slavery, oh my gosh. This article will examine ancient slavery and its lack of African and or dark-skinned context. So here they try to show this as a Negroid. This is not a Negroid, although there are a couple that do definitely look Negroid, and they call them Negroid. This is called an Ethiopian, and look how Caucasian he looks. And then they've taken this Pan guy that's supposed to be somewhat of a goat god situation here, amulet, and said, well, look, that looks Negro, especially with his nose rubbed down. And Pan has featurettes and stuff that's like that really doesn't go with a Negro. It's trying to put a goat god thing onto it. It's terrible they picked these two pictures, because blacks like to use about 8 more that they have, and these mugs and so on like that of course come from later, and so they can't really use them too much to say earlier. But this is from 2nd century AD, right? A young African man. Well, North Africa was always Caucasians all the way around, and the definition of Caucasian race itself will tell you all the way around North Africa, yeah, and up through the Horn of Africa. So that just covers it right there. And they explain all of the Asia parts and everything too, and how huge that Caucasia was in. People try to say, oh, you were just from some mountains, and it's like, no, that was like a holotype of the people. But strangely, the people that are yelling this stuff and mad were really only from a little part of West Africa and weren't involved in the rest of these places. But people are getting taught all kinds of crap nowadays. A different perspective on geography. First things first, Africa did not exist in the ancient world as it does today. Once upon a time, Libya was referred to as much of the continent as the Greeks could see. And there really was known and spoken about, exactly. Namely, much of the northern portion of the landmass. Meanwhile, Ethiopia applied to the southern portion of the continent. In ancient Greek, Ethiopia loosely translates the phase of sunburnt face, or burnt face, because the Greeks believed those living in the continent were perpetually sunburnt or tanned, just like we would have people living in Florida today, and South Texas, and all these areas that are pretty much regionally like this in comparison to far northern places where people can easily keep themselves pale. And it was not, as far as current research shows, intended as a form of insult. And really it wasn't, but it was. There's two ways of looking at it, as saying that these people had to be farmers, they had to do things. I don't know if people have realized, but in ancient Greek, Egyptian, Minoan, Mitanni, all the art of the area, men are drawn quite often, if they're a man in action, drawn in a red ochre color, and the women are extremely pale. And this is a Caucasian edict that goes way back when, to whenever we did become, hunter-gatherers into farmers, where the women didn't have to work. They could stay home, They would stay pale, we would be out in the sun all the time, and therefore it gives you that idea. You can see it even reflected symbolically in Egyptian art, and of course, you just look at any of the other ones, and you can see the same type of thing. And nobility are looked as the same way, where they didn't have to. It's almost a caste system eventually, with its colors and its symbology that goes along with it. But it's not necessarily a form of an insult, because it was just how crap happened. For there was really not that much nobility back then and so on, but some of these nobilities were looked at as gods too. Of course, the leaders of Egypt, Rome, all these places were supposed to be symbolically, God on earth. In fact, to this day, the Pope is supposed to be symbolically God's representative on earth, in a way, another echoing of a Jesus concept, or someone that can help to, clarify the one that's the key point that you're supposed to look at versus what everybody goes with. Let's continue. A small portion of Upper Africa, west of where Carthage was once located, was a region the Romans called Mauritania. The Romans teamed up with this kingdom during their subjugation of Jugurtha of Numidia in 100 BC or so, a little before, under General Gaius Marius, and this is where part of the name comes from. And the Moors and so on that we hear about later is just because of that geographical region. And of course the Greeks name every damn thing. But so even here, the white slaves of Barbary. But let's continue. Oh, this is supposed to have been some mulatto kid. Although he has curlyish hair, his features seem to be so negroid, and because people see it as a dark bronze, say that's got to be a Negro, right? He's naked and so on, just wrapped around it. And so it's called an Ethiopian. Hellenistic bronze statue of an African known as Ethiopian youth, the Met. So that's what they called it. Anyhow, in Frank Snowden's text, Black in Antiquity, he references the consistent inclusion of the Ethiopians who live south of Egypt or farther up the Nile in classical Greek poetry. Among the earliest Greeks with knowledge of Ethiopia was Homer, though Snowden does not indicate that other writers such as Herodotus were occasionally known to confuse Ethiopia with India. No, they didn't confuse it. They were talking about dark-skinned people everywhere. In a moment, I'll show you what this person didn't seem to look up. It's literally the definition. In fact, let's do that now. So, little does he also know there's a term as white Ethiopians. Leuco-Aethiops, leuco meaning white, is a term found in ancient Roman and Greek literature that referred to various non-Negro and light-complected populations inhabiting the Ethiopian regions of antiquity. The exonym is used by Pliny the Elder and is also mentioned by Pompeius Mela, Ptolemy, and Orosius. These authors did not, however, agree on the exact location of the white Ethiopians. Well, no crap, because there was a bunch of different ones around. Who are these guys? They're farmers with nobility. Anyhow, so, like Leo Africanus, Leo being a lion, and, so the African lion, well, Africa was named after another Caucasian, with the same type of last name. Before that, it was Libya, as it said before, and all this is considered Libya. In fact, it goes just a little bigger than this. This map that we're looking at right here shows you where one location of these Leuco-Aethiops people are, but noted in other locations, and then the Garamantes that are here, and that the Aethiops people are down here southern, all the way through and into the Sahara Desert at the time, which was drying up and had wadis and oases and things, but was pretty much dried up at the time. And so if we pass through the interior of Africa, Pliny the Elder wrote this, in a southerly direction beyond the Gatuli, after having traversed the intervening deserts, we shall find first of all the Libya Egyptians, and then the country where the Leuco-Aethiopians dwell. So there's white people down through there? That's amazing. You can look this thing up. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but it's quite telling. And he tells you, in 16th century explorer Leo Africanus described the existence of various white or olive-skinned groups of individuals inhabiting territories and kingdoms south of the Sahara. besides the white and tawny Moors of the former Africa preconsulature. He indicates that such light complexions people were concentrated in the Horn of Africa, comprising much of the Aldal Sultanites' native population. People say, oh, well, Ethiopia, and that's the people that are there now. And it's like, that's not the people that are there now. And genetics will tell you they're at least 40% Caucasian, admixed, and some groups over 50. So, you know, you can read down onto this, but then these type of people that had a darker skin here, you know, to those people, yeah, look, they're tanned. And so what is it? Well, it's sunburnt faces. When people get out like this and stuff, what are they referring to? They're not referring to darkened Negroids. I mean, Homer and the Iliad and all these places where they describe them at is not actually where we say Ethiopia is today. In fact, if we just look at Ethiopia of Antiquity, you can see the little brown areas that are there, right? And that's not, look, it's in the Iliad, it's in the Odyssey, it's in a few places. Some of these parts are parts of Africa, but if we look at this thing and we're honest with ourselves, we're seeing that it's the side here and not even up where Ethiopia and the Horn is today, where they say there's white people and white people and white people and white people down here, right? That's what they just showed a minute ago. And white people all over here, but here it says Ethiopians, right? And then there's brown people all here and brown people all here, these tan people. Well, maybe they're just not as pale as the Greeks. It seems like the Greeks really were talking about skin colors, doesn't it? It does. They describe people on the other side of the Red Sea over here too. These people being in here. So what are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about Negroids necessarily, and today's admixed Negroid that are there is definitely not what we were talking about before. Let's see if I can get back to that real quick. Really? So here we are back. So Ethiopia with India sometimes, and what I didn't show you in that map there, what I didn't say whenever we were looking at it is you don't see Sub-Saharan Africa at all. They didn't really know it existed at that time. Nobody drawed it on maps or anything like that. Even when Necho did his search all the way around, which they usually show on those maps, there's no indication of it. There is an indication that the Phoenicians used to trade with some people, that they would leave stuff on the beach and then go back and put out a fire and do things and have people go back and forth trading with them. But other than that, there's really no inclination of anybody having had interaction with anybody. And of course, that would have been beach or coastal living Negroids, which really wasn't so much happening as much either. So let's look on. However, poetic observations as to the physical characteristics and province of these people were sparse or vague until the 5th century BC. This, one could argue, may indicate how unimportant skin color and race were in the ancient world. Intellectual capacity, military skill, and xenia, or hospitality, ranked far higher in importance. And I've told you about xenia being with flowers here just recently in a video, and how that went with ancient goddesses and nymphs and so on, and the water goddesses of the Nile, the Nilus, and how Aegyptus and the brother of Aegyptus was in the Greeks and so on in the ancient tales of mythology. But it was unimportant for skin color and race in the ancient world, because they only ran into like Asians whenever the Proto-Indo-Europeans went all the way to China, and they only ran into India people whenever the Proto-Indo-Europeans and Caucasians and Aryans went over all the way into India. And other than that, they were all variations of a Caucasian. The people living in certain areas there today are not the people that used to live there a few thousand years ago. I think everybody realizes that, but people keep saying things like this. Let's continue. Further, Snowden dictates that when race was used to refer to certain peoples, it was likely in reference to location rather than skin. That is, Hesiod is the first group Scythians with Ethiopians. Hesiod doesn't group Scythians with Ethiopians as we think of them. He tells you that some of the Scythians and these nomadic farming people and pastoralists that are living out here in the steppe area have quite the tans, running around on their horses constantly all day. People who later came to be cited frequently as examples of racial and geographical extremes, northerners and southerners. As mentioned above, the ancient Ethiopians were named such because of a misguided belief regarding their skin color. Scythians were also notoriously dark-skinned in ancient records. However, as they were from wetter and colder places, they were given a different name. That's not the way that works either. You're not going to say, well, oh, that's black people from wetter areas, and so they no. That's very misleading. In reality, we're talking about Caucasians. Of course, let's not be ignorant. Here is the Caucasian, riding on the horse, huh? And he likes to ride the steps. He has the leopard skin cape, and he goes across the steps. He is swarthy from riding all day like the cowboy, and he does not have the cowboy hat. Huh? Let's continue. Scythian horsemen. Differing color is a fact of life. According to Before Color Prejudice, also by Snowden, prejudice specifically to black culture was not a large piece of the ancient Roman world. In fact, none of the world, really. The Egyptians had problems with the Nubians, and they called them vile Nubian troglodytes, and they weren't allowed in to Egypt itself, and there are boundary stillays they still have today that tell you such. They tell you they're not even allowed in. They can only come to Icon and trade and things along that nature, but people want to overlook that, especially when they're trying to say that the Egyptians were black. And of course, the people touting this are West Africans that actually didn't even know Egypt existed, and they have no genetical or cultural connection to it whatsoever, but they try real hard. So, not only was ancient Rome very closely tied to the shores of modern-day Africa, or northern Africa, of course, with the Punic Wars and things, but they're going to say that and try to just leave it vague. Discrimination based on skin would have been considered unusual, particularly as the later emperors of the Severan dynasty were Libyan, i.e. African themselves, meaning Caucasians and endemic Caucasians all across North Africa, and along with the Phoenicians and so on. Further, Ovid, writing under the first emperor, suggests that a black lover of Aurora was the father of Memnon. People say black, but no, this is a man who is swarthy or tanned, and being a nobility, people are like, hey. But hey, sometimes people have tans. Perseus, the son of Zeus by Danae, married the dark-skinned Andromeda, which is a false thought. Look at Andromeda in any art. Whose father, king of the Ethiopians, was a mulatto. Now they try to interject a mulatto into it, hopefully. At least in their eyes of a vase painter in the mid-5th century, which isn't the vase we're fixing to look at. Therefore, one can reasonably presume the skin color was not a factor of racism, but rather a fact of life. Discrimination was predominantly a class or wealth-based decision instead. And no, there was people that were extremely primitive, these West Africans, where they would have just really sharpened sticks, and steel was really not in their ancient self. I know people can try to show knot cultures and things like that. Whatever happened to them? Never mind. We don't need to go there. I've been through every little facet of it. It's funny, people get in my videos and they get down on the bottom like I've never heard of blah, 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 and they start ranting. Incorporating new members into Roman society. It is paramount to include the laws of Roman citizenship in a discussion of ancient racism, or the lack thereof, in regards to black individuals in Rome. There really were no ancient black individuals in Rome. Later, there were some in the slave markets. Most of those were castrated as eunuchs and used in certain ways, but what's he going to try to say? How the Romans handled out citizenship says a lot to their ethnicity, values. Members of the conquered tribes and civilizations was easily be made Roman citizens through a variety of methods. Yeah, Caucasians could. In fact, Romans adopted in a lot of people once they came the giant society. They had no choice but to, in the way that they did it. They didn't do it kind of like the Persians, where the Persians kind of left everybody alone. They kind of more encompassed that. You saw that with the Greeks too, and they wanted to put their statues everywhere. They'd kind of leave you alone half-assed, but they wanted to put their statues there. In the Bible, that was looked at as being too much, and then you hear all this stuff about it, and they wouldn't let it in their temples and as an idol. See, and anyhow, so members of the conquered tribes and civilization could easily be made Roman citizens through a variety of methods. Serving in the army for a certain period of time was one of the most common. Marrying into a Roman family was not unheard of, and imperial decrees, though few and far between, were occasional occurrences, most significantly under Emperor Caracalla, and I believe we'll look at Caracalla here in a moment. Caracalla was somebody who was from the Punic Wars and is actually like a Carthaginian from there, and therefore you could see how they would adopt in each other a little bit more, but within themselves this did not involve other ethnicities. They're like hey, South Indians and Asians, you're all... No, that wasn't going on, and it really wasn't going on with blacks either, but people want to try to say this. Notably, handing out citizenship in these ways and others had nothing to do with the way a person looked, acted, spoke. In these cases, the Romans gave out citizenship based solely on the needs of their own culture, benefited the Roman Empire, while simultaneously encouraging loyalty from the conquered. And I'd like to see somebody in elder times trying to show something like that. Funny, whenever you get from these articles, there are people that are connected to it. Why are the nose missing from so many Egyptian statues? They just say, oh, it's a hide because they were black. And actually, it's not. It's zealot Christians and things, because they were the ones that had held the Jews at the time and stuff back whenever. Never mind. Look at Caracalla here. Let me get that out of the way. Yeah. Big, thick, big mountain man kind of looking guy. And yeah, all these Carthaginians and Hannibal and all those guys and stuff, they're all Caucasians. Caucasians were all... What the map we were looking at of Ethiopia was all Caucasians again. Every single bit of that, with the Nubians poking in that one little spot there. Other than that, everywhere of the known world they were looking at was pretty much Caucasians. The Mongols were pushed way up to the far right, pretty much out of that picture totally. Over all the Scythians and everything that you see in there. Yeah, got a lot of videos on it and stuff. We're not going to go there. But that's Caracalla. And they say it was a statue, and then they just took it off and just made it a bust. Caracalla's Constantino Antoniana, which gave free men, not necessarily light-skinned men, citizenship, is often considered a move to increase the revenue of the imperial treasury, where they took people from around the Mediterranean and allowed them to be citizens too, because they were tanned. And if they stayed inside for a long time, they would wax pale like Jacob out of the Bible. Requiring a certain amount of time in the military service created loyalty and community between citizens and non-citizens, with the latter gaining legal acceptance at the end in gratitude. So generally this is almost like an indentured servitude situation, but there were a lot of cultures that you could fight for them in an army and everything, but you were still part of that army and you weren't really a Roman citizen. But then they called everybody Romans. All road leads to Rome. Friends, Romans, countrymen. Lend me your ears. Whatever the Roman government's personal gains, handing out citizenship was a win-win situation, and one of the reasons scholars believe the empire lasted so long. But to reiterate, is not to say some Romans were displeased with the sudden inclusion of foreigners into the officials' fold of the empire. It seems that skin tone was not a primary factor in the Roman conscience. Of course it wasn't, because they were all Caucasians, and it didn't matter if you had a suntan. Differences were recognized. Individuals likely had their own prejudices, but universally there was not a blatant discrimination against darker-skinned groups, because they really weren't in play at that time. Here we see an ancient mosaic, and this is a tan-skinned, red-headed, red-bearded Caucasian with his pale wife, as shown in all the art, all the way through time, keeping their women pale, at least showing them in art, maybe even paler than they were, symbolically, just like the water symbol and the unity here, and swastikas and symbol like that are shown in all these cultures that pass way back to Proto-Indo-European origins that people don't really realize anymore. But what are they going to say? Mosaic of a Roman soldier embracing a woman. Was that a Negro? No, that was a tan soldier from being out in the sun, but red-headed too. This article does not pretend to cover all sides of the ongoing debate on the topic of racism in the ancient world. I don't think there's really a debate. At one point there was none, and then there was black people, and then genetic bias and racism that we call today is a different thing than saying Italians don't like Greeks. Right. So the aim of this article is merely to provide examples and the evidence of ways in which the classical world does not appear to emphasize a mentality of lighter-skinned Greeks and Romans discriminating against darker-skinned, tanned Libyan Caucasians, Ethiopian Caucasians, Scythian Caucasians, etc., based on the color of their skin. This issue is more often seen in debates regarding barbarianism. Well, barbers used to be the old ancient doctors and the hair cutting thing, and that has to do with beards. And sometimes when we talk about barbarian, everybody thinks they're ugh or something crazy, or hey, how about Conan the Barbarian? But Barber and Barbary Coast and things like that have to do with beards. For Barbarossa is red beard, Rosa is red, and Barbar is beard, and therefore we kind of get a different understanding as to these words and how they're used nowadays versus how they may have been used in ancient days, like Ethiopian. So he tells you barbarism, which is itself a debate of civilized versus uncivilized, and that's the way we look at it today, but it may have not had so much to do with that, for indeed it seemed the Greeks called it about quite a few people that just didn't speak Greek. And it is not incorporated into this article. In fact, what is incorporated in this article is trying to incorporate black people into a culture that they really weren't in at the time, in some way, skin, form, or fashion, by talking about a skin color situation that is, this is 2019 in the world here. Here we go. The extent of undocumented black racism may still remain up for debate. However, in universal Greek and Roman context, skin color was likely a secondary or even tertiary basis for discrimination in classic culture. It certainly wasn't a prominent factor in decisions of battle allies and citizenship. Oh no. In fact, they even used some in the Punic Wars and stuff, but did that mean that they were all of a sudden, Punic? No, not necessarily. Did that mean that they're Greek? No, it didn't. Let's see, bibliography, when black first became worthless. The New Frontiers and Law Society in the Roman World. African and Africans seen by writers. Talking about Caucasian. Frontiers and Black Diaspora Studies and Comparative Black History Enhanced by Our Knowledge. The Negro Education Review by Hine. I don't think that's going to be accurate. The Jewthine War. Color Before Prejudice. The Ancient View of Blacks. Blacks in Antiquity. Ethiopians in the Greco-Roman Experience. I wonder if Snowden ever looked up the definition of Ethiopian and then realized what they were talking about. And then in the Iliad and the Odyssey, how they had gotten so dark-skinned. And there's even a tale about how she takes him from being that to giving him his color of the skin of his youth whenever he used to ride out on the boats and do all the things, so it sent him back home swarthy and loving. And was this black? No. Tanned, seamen, yeah, these mermaids, these mermen type of thing. Kind of disgusting that people try to twist ancient history around when there's a lot of people that still know it real well. I just fear that in the next generation or two, people are going to make so much stupidity out of it that it really loses its truth and its value into what it originally had. Look at the red-headed man and the blonde-headed wife here with her long hair hanging down. That actually becomes part of trees and the tree of life. And a symbology of ancient Caucasians that herald mankind to everybody. Like, share, and subscribe, guys, and enjoy. I'm sure there's a lot more I could have gone into here, but we'll continue later. Peace.